Hey, Techno Studs. In this video, we're going to talk about network security. So in this video, we're going to talk more about that logical side of the bits flowing back and forth, the communication that's happening across our network, and how to safeguard it. So in this video, let's talk about network security. We're going to start out by talking about how to protect the peripheral of our network, or the perimeter of our network, the outside of our network. And one of the ways we do that is with a firewall. So we'll talk about what a firewall is and what it does. We'll get into what an IDS/IPS is, or a intrusion detection or prevention system is. We're going to get into wireless security and what wireless security looks like. We'll talk about zero trust and how zero trust plays into protecting the inside of our network as well. We're going to get into port security and how it can protect us against unauthorized people plugging into our network. We'll get into network access control, or NAC, and how it protects our network. We'll talk about segmentation and how we can segment things to further protect our network. We'll talk about a screen network, which is a type of segmentation. And then we'll wrap things up talking about some deceptive technology that's out there, things like honeypots and honeynets. Perimeter security is really talking about how we control the access into our network. So if we think of a large room that we want to control access to, then we would be most concerned around the doorway, we'd be most concerned around a window, any access points into that room. So that's really perimeter security is. What is the access to inside of our network? And a big way that we guard access into our network is through the use of a firewall. A firewall allows certain traffic in and out of our network while blocking other traffic. And so a firewall is a big key to making sure that we only have the correct traffic that's going in and out of our network, and that we're safeguarding the communication on the perimeter of our network. We can also put in intrusion detection systems or intrusion protection systems. So often this comes integrated into our firewall, but it also could be possibly a separate piece of equipment that is helping us out with this IDS/IPS. So an intrusion detection system notifies us when there's some sort of attack or some sort of malicious behavior or some sort of suspicious behavior. If there's something happening there's somebody trying to break into our network, this detection system will allow it to detect if somebody's actively trying to poke their way into this network. Then there's the protection system. The protection system takes it a step forward. It not just detects something that's happened, but it will actually take action against it. And so one question might be well, why don't I just implement a protection system? That sounds better, doesn't it? Because, hey, it'll actually take action and stop that from happening. Well, one of the problems is that anytime you have something that's looking at certain behavior and trying to determine what the behavior is, and that what you're going to do is you're going to have something called false positives. And so if you have something that's actively stopping that traffic from coming into your network, you're going to have sometimes when there's legitimate traffic that can't make a connection. So an example is maybe you have this sitting in front of your network, or perhaps it's maybe in front of some web servers, and then it starts preventing certain traffic from accessing those web servers. That could be problematic if it's customers trying to reach your data. So this is a detection system, will detect if there's some sort of malicious activity that's happening or suspicious activity happening, versus protection will actually take action against it. A wired network allows us to connect one piece of equipment to the other. And if we don't want to have communication between two pieces of equipment, we can physically disconnect those wires. Well, that's not the case with wireless. And so when it comes to wireless, that data is just floating in the air. It's going back and forth through the air. And so anybody can listen in on that data. So it's really important that that data is encrypted, so that way if somebody were to actually retrieve it, they couldn't actually read the data or read the information that's going back and forth. So that is that wireless is inherently insecure, and so we need to take steps to make sure it is secure. And so that is going to be one thing that we're going to want to make sure that we have on our network. With traditional networking, you are mostly concerned with the security around the access points to your network. So this would be like from the internet into your network, you would put things like firewall because that would be a hot place right there. Same thing with access points. The security of the different ports on a switch could go either way, because if it was a secured building, then the idea is if you were inside the building, then you were okay on the network. But there are some times when this would also be an access point into the network as well. So the idea though is as long as you controlled access into your network, once you were on the network, then you had a certain level of legitimacy on the network. But this concept came by where, well, that doesn't really cover us, because what happens if a machine is infected in here, or somebody breaks into the building and plugs into our network, or plugs some sort of other device into our network? And so really this idea that we should have zero trust on our network, that whoever connects into our network, no matter what it is consistently authenticated onto our system and authorized to certain resources. So the idea behind zero trust is that we are going to not just assume that just because somebody is inside of our buildings that they are now safe, or because they've been connected to our equipment for X amount of days that they're still safe. We're going to continue to monitor them and make sure that they are safe and should be accessing the resources that they can access. Port security is something that we can implement on a switch to verify whatever is connected into that switch. The switch could be placed in an insecure environment, but even if it's placed in a secure environment, you never know who is going to be able to break into that environment and then be able to have access to your network by plugging in. So what we can do is we can, on a port by port basis, set up port security that will allow us to control who has access to that port and who can communicate across that port. And there are several methods that we can actually use to implement port security, but that's what it is that we are implementing security on a port by port basis for this switch. Network access control, or NAC, can be used to help us implement zero trust. That is, it's one of the ways that we can make sure that things that come onto our network should be on our network. So an example of this is this machine right here might have the login credentials to access the network. However, does this machine, is it fully patched? Does it have its antivirus? Is it up to date with its antivirus? And so what we would do is we would install a software on here that would monitor the state of this machine and if it's got its patches and if it's all up to date. And it wouldn't allow it on the network until it met certain qualifications. So that's what network access control allows us to do. Allows us to control the access from certain machines depending on what we say that machine needs before it actually can get access onto the network. And one thing that we may want to practice on our network is segmentation, where we segment the different resources to certain roles or departments or certain types of users that we have on our system. And so here we have maybe several departments. So we have the administration department, and they have access to different resources. Operations has access to different resources, and sales. And so we can actually have a separate network, separate equipment, separate data, separate servers, separate databases, separate keys, separate ways to get access to each one of these different segments. And then this allows, so somebody from administration doesn't necessarily have access to operations, or operations doesn't necessarily have access to sales. One thing we may want to segment is the management traffic. And that is, we have different pieces of equipment here. We have switches here that need to be managed. We have servers here that need to be managed. We have database servers that need to be managed. So there's different stuff on our network that needs to be managed. And so we may want the administration group to be able to access these servers from a web portal standpoint, and maybe they need access to some of the data through that, but they don't need direct access to the databases. That would not necessarily be something that they need to have access to. Or same thing with the administration of that server. And so we wanted to break out this management traffic separately and put it on its own network. And then the only people that have access to the management traffic that gains access to these switches, gains access to the back end of these servers, would be people who need to have access to managing that. And then we put things on there like our simple network management protocol, which I said we can use to like monitor the traffic that's going across here. We could secure this so that way other people aren't going to be able to see the management traffic that's going across on this network. Another way that we may segment is using a screen subnet, also known as a DMZ or a demilitarized zone. So a screen subnet is a separate network that has maybe some more publicly accessible devices that are on it. So for instance, this is a bank of web servers right here. We want people to visit our web servers. And so we have rules in place on the firewall that allows traffic to get to these web servers. Now, the problem is if those web servers existed on our internal network, if they were ever compromised, then our whole internal network is compromised as well. So we put it on a separate network over here that gives access to external users to access them, but allows us to continue to protect our internal servers and network so that way people don't have access to this internal network. We could also use deceptive or disruption technologies. And so an example of this might be a honeypot. We would set up a separate machine here that would be in its own little segment. And then if somebody is trying to hack into our network, we could actually put them onto this machine. And then what they'll do is they think that they're actually on one of our machines on the network and start looking into it, start researching, and we can monitor their activity and see what's going on to see how they're attempting to get into our network. A honeynet is the same thing, except for it's like setting up a whole other network that does the analyzation. A honey file, the same thing, except for it's a file that looks tantalizing, that looks like it's something that they would want to hack into and gain access to. And a honey token is just any like data that we would put out there. It's all would be deceptive in the sense that it's not actual data, it's not actual networks, it's not actual machine, it's not an actual file. It's not something that we're too concerned about. It just mimics something that looks like what an attacker would want. They go after that instead, and it helps us analyze the behavior of an attacker and then be able to put safeguards in place on our network to make sure that we're not susceptible to the same methodology that that hacker is using. So it's really important to get that perimeter security right. That's your first line of defense against threats that are out there. So we're going to put up things like firewalls and IDS and IPS systems and wireless security to make sure we secure that network, even things like port security. Once we have access into our network though, things can actually change. Different people can get onto that machine, that machine could get infected. So we may want to implement a zero trust model. And that model really says that we're not going to really trust anybody that's on our network. We're going to consistently authenticate them and make sure that they should be on our network. And so we implement things like the network access control to make sure that machines have the proper updates and patches and antivirus and things in place to make sure that they are going to be safe on our network. We also talked about how segmentation allows us to make us less vulnerable and put things like our management traffic onto separate networks so we keep those more secure. We also talked about screened networks and how creating a DMZ or a screened network can allow us to open up resources to the outside world without opening up our internal networks to the outside world. And then we wrap things up talking about some deceptive technologies, things that we can put in place like a honey net or a honey pot that would attract a threat and they would go after that instead. And then we could analyze their behavior to implement controls on our internal network.